Has carbon dioxide caused temperatures and sea levels to rise beyond historic rates? Have severe storms increased in frequency or intensity over the last, 30 or 40 years? Has global change harmed the coral reefs? Have carbon dioxide concentrations preceded rising global temperatures? I think we all know what the standard answer to these questions is, but we are going to talk about them at a little greater depth from another angle today on today's Lighthouse Briefing from the Independent Institute. Welcome to all of our friends who are joining us this morning. I'm Graham Walker, coming to you from the Independent Institute here in Oakland, California. As many of you know, we are located in the San Francisco Bay Area, almost a stone's throw from San Francisco and a short hop to Silicon Valley. So we attempt to bring the world resources and a perspective that they can't easily get elsewhere, and that's what we're going to do today. Our goal today is to offer somewhat of a special forum for the members of our Lighthouse Society who sustain the work of the Independent Institute very generously, as well as a few specially invited other friends today. We want to give you all a front row seat on new initiatives here at Independent Institute. In this case, our new book, Hot Talk, Cold Science, which you can see me holding up here. And to discuss it, we have one of the co-authors of the book, Dr. Anthony Lupo, joining us from the University of Missouri today. Dr. Lupo, welcome to the Independent Institute.
Well, thank you, Dr. Walker. I'm glad to be with you here today and to discuss the book and the topic of climate change.
Yeah, it's really a privilege to have you. We are impressed with your record. Some years ago, you joined us as a research fellow, and we're grateful for your affiliation. Your main role these days is as a professor of atmospheric science, and you are the principal investigator of the Global Climate Change Group in the School of Natural Resources at the University of Missouri. That's a pretty exalted position. You've had a front row seat at a lot of this stuff, haven't you?
Absolutely. We are looking at climate and climate change, especially as it applies to our area of the country, since our area of the country is an agriculturally sensitive region.
Yes.
But also I've always had an interest in looking at the large scale patterns. And so I really like to look at global changes as well.
You have published an immense amount of peer-reviewed work in all the appropriate places. I think I counted 135 peer-reviewed publications in scientific journals like the Journal of Atmospheric Sciences, the Journal of Climate, Journal of Geophysical Research, Atmospheres. You have been awarded the Missouri Academy of Sciences Most Distinguished Scientist Award. You're a member of the American Meteorology Society. I am bragging on you, but I am doing so to make it clear to all of our friends joining us that you're at the top of the game when it comes to these things, and yet you're not with the center of the consensus either. And that's why you joined with Fred Singer and David Legates on this important new book, Hot Talk, Cold Science. By the way, the book was published last month. The book is available on our own website, independent.org, as well as on Amazon. And I encourage everybody to get a copy of it. And I thank our friends and supporters for making it possible to publish such a book. The book, of course, has quite a history. What is it, 22 years ago, the first edition was created by Fred Singer, the principal author. And Dr. Singer is now deceased. You knew Fred Singer quite well, did you not?
Well, I knew of him. I knew of his work, and I think I had met him once or twice at a conference. He's a little bit older than I was, and his career kind of overlapped with mine. The end of his career overlapped with the beginning of mine. And of course, I'm familiar with his work because of his many publications. And so it was a great honor to be asked to be on this book project with Dr. Singer.
Of course, he is now deceased, unfortunately, and we are grateful that he left this remarkable legacy of this book, which undoes a lot of things that needed undoing, apparently. He was at this on this work for many years. I mean, 22 years ago, I think, was the second edition of the book, if I'm not mistaken. Why was he, I wonder, so far-seeing on climate change trends and the flow of opinion in the scientific community? How come he saw what others didn't see? Any ideas on that?
Well, there are some people in our field that are just very perceptive. They enjoy what they do. And if you enjoy what you do and you read as much as you can about the various topics, you're going to be able to see into the future a little bit.
He was very accomplished himself. He had a PhD in physics from Princeton. He designed the first satellite instrument for measuring atmospheric ozone and was a principal developer of scientific and other weather satellites. He was involved in NOAA, NOAA's National Advisory Committee on Oceans and Atmospheres. He was a scientist with the U.S. Department of Transportation, the Environmental Protection Agency. He was a founder of the Non-Governmental International Panel on Climate Change, so-called IPCC. And yet he is derided nowadays as something of a climate denier. But in fact, he was no science denier, but he was at the top of his game, as you are in this field. So let's get into some of the particulars of this, if we may, Dr. Lupo. It's okay if I call you Tony?
Absolutely.
Okay, Tony, you're on a first name basis with all of our friends on this call today, so we appreciate your being willing to make yourself available. They're going to have questions, by the way, but I have a few of my own. There are a lot of things that we hear about. For example, what's this thing about the hockey stick? This is discussed in chapter 5 of the book. What does the hockey stick allegedly prove, and what are the facts?
Well, the hockey stick was meant to show that the climate of the past 1,000 years has been fairly stationary, and that when human influence began to ramp up at the end of the 19th century, that our influence has really made the climate change well beyond what it has historically. And the problem with it, and I believe the book highlights this very well, is that the authors relied on only one species of tree, and they were trying to match this data with instrumental data, and they didn't do so in a very correct way because others were not able to produce their work. Other scientists asked for the data and the code. They wouldn't turn it over for a while. They wouldn't.
But I thought that reproducibility was like a signature of real empirical science.
Well, it's supposed to be, and they did reluctantly give it over, and the scientists that tried to reproduce it could not.
What did it allegedly say or demonstrate, the hockey stick theory?
Well, again, the hockey stick theory was supposed to show that humans are just pushing the climate beyond what we know historically, and that we're just overriding the natural system and creating changes that are just well outside of the natural variability.
But in fact, for example, in some of the measurements of carbon dioxide, I think this book and the research that went into it suggests that there's reason to question whether carbon dioxide levels preceded or followed changes in temperature. Can you explain what that means?
Yes, absolutely. There are folks who believe that because of the way carbon dioxide interacts between the atmospheres and the oceans, that it's not very clear as to which leads which. Does the carbon dioxide increase in the atmosphere first, then the temperature follow it? Or does the temperature increase first, cause some changes at the boundaries, and then the carbon dioxide
Wait, I know the
that.
answer. I know the answer because I'm a layman and I've been watching the news for these years. It's obvious, like everybody, all the smart people tell me that carbon dioxide goes up first and that pushes the temperature up. I thought that was like, everyone knows that, right?
Well, that's supposed to be the common wisdom, so.
But it's not demonstrated. Is there any evidence to the reverse?
There is some evidence to the reverse. I'm not familiar with that research as much, but I have heard about it, and I've heard that there is evidence that the reverse may be true. And when you're looking on time scales of thousands of years, like this research is, when you find a correlation between carbon dioxide and global temperature, that's not going to tell you anything about whether you're getting a lead with the
Right.
temperature or a
Mm-hmm.
lag with the temperature. So
Mm-hmm.
that's where we need researchers to actually dig in and find the
Correlation
answer.
is not causation.
Yeah, that's the simple way of saying it. Correlation does
The
not.
layman's way of putting it.
Right, right.
Well, again, we laymen, we think we know a lot of stuff, but for example, everybody knows that severe droughts and storms have become much more frequent over the last, whatever, century or so than they were before. Is that true?
Well, according to the book and according to even some of the IPCC results, that's not necessarily the case. We're not seeing an increase in droughts. We're not seeing an increase in floods. We are seeing an increase in things like tornadoes and thunderstorms, but that's because there's more people to see them. So
Oh,
we can't really judge the number of tornadoes or the number of severe storms.
at
Number
least
of
going
Yeah,
backwards for a long time when tornadoes may have
absolutely.
been occurring in unpopulated locales, right?
Oh, absolutely. Because if you go back to the 1920s, the common wisdom was that the United States got about 100 tornadoes a year. Well, everybody was living on the eastern coast and the Gulf Coast at that time. Once the middle started to get more populated and weather instruments got better, now we get 1,200 tornadoes a year, and that's certainly not climate change.
It's
That's
just more documentation.
more documentation and more exposure.
And that reminds me of the fact that as I looked at the book and some of the related research, it seems that how climate events and data are measured has a great deal to do with what is measured. The methodology may overwhelm the facts. So, for example, the book discusses, I forget which chapter it is in, the ways in which surface temperature can be misleadingly measured depending upon which measurement instruments you're relying upon. Can you tell us a little bit about some of the vagaries of temperature measurement?
Yes, many years ago, it was very standard that thermometers were used, liquid and glass thermometers were used, and they were put in a shelter. And this shelter was put over a grassy surface. Today, you
Mm.
have automated sensors, and those automated sensors try to mimic that environment. And of course, they're placed over a square that has white gravel in it today. And that's a little different from the past as well.
Hmm.
And of course, where you put your thermometer makes a difference. Here in the Missouri area, we've got the example of St. Louis. Lambert Airport was a rural facility many
Right.
years ago. Now it's more of an urban site. And so the measurements have been tainted a little bit by the urban heat island effect.
That's intriguingly parallel to what you said about the tornadoes, because tornadoes were occurring where people weren't, and measurement was not occurring. Temperature measurement wasn't occurring where people weren't, but where people were. And where people were pouring cement over stuff like around Lambert Airport. And over the years, every time I've flown into St. Louis, over the past 20 years or so, there's more and more stuff built up around the Lambert Airport area, which suggests that it's going to be a heat sink more than it used to be when it was farmers' fields.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
But does that change around Lambert Airport tell us anything about global temperature changes?
No, in fact, it doesn't tell us about global temperature changes. It can tell us about local temperature
Oh, for sure.
changes,
Yeah. Hmm.
but and it can tell us about the heat island effect, and we have to have studies of that so that we can account for it more properly. So stations like that do have their value. It's just that we have to realize what we're going after.
Right. And so if you put all your measurement stations in the places where there's the highest concentration of human buildings and cement and roads, but you have fewer measurement stations in other locations where there's less human activity, it may skew your results toward warmth. Is that right?
Oh yes, that's for certain. I mean, if you put all your measurements in those kind of environments, you're going to get a warmer temperature at the surface for sure.
So, but how else can you measure temperature? You got to put your surface measurements not only in populated areas, but also in unpopulated areas. But there's more than surface temperature measurement. Can't you measure from other locations?
Yes, well, if you're talking about other methodologies and
Yes.
measuring in the upper atmosphere, that's where weather balloons come in. And of course, we've been using those since about the late 1930s,
Okay.
and they became more numerous around the early 1950s. And those can measure atmospheric temperature all the way up to about 20 miles up, and at the most.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of times they don't get that high. And you can also use satellite instruments. And of course, that circles back to Fred Singer, who was very instrumental in developing some of those early techniques.
Mm-hmm.
But satellite measurements are used all the time to measure both surface temperatures and upper air temperatures.
So this is why I guess in chapter 8, the book talks about the unreliable surface temperature record, which I think means that a more broad-based measurement of temperature would give a more likely accurate gauge of temperature than merely surface temperature.
Yes, and that gets into a philosophical point that that I've discussed with some folks who are physicists and mathematicians at the university. They kind of bristle at the notion that you can have one measurement that represents the entire globe.
Mm-hmm.
And so, how do you do this? Uh, in my opinion, as long as you're doing a measurement that's consistent over the years, then you can at least look at trends and changes.
What should we say, or what can you say with any degree of certainty about the trajectory of Earth's atmospheric temperatures? Is the warming unusual? Is the warming dramatically more than usual? We assume, based on average news reports, that it must be the case that all the measurements of temperature all point to dramatically increasing warming. Is that accurate?
Well, it is accurate that it is warming, and it has been warming since about the middle of the 19th century. But we have to realize that the planet was cooler. At least some of our proxy data show that there was a little ice age about 500 years ago, and we're just getting out of that. And so temperatures are warming. And are they warming historically quickly? I don't think it's I don't think it's possible to know that. Temperatures did go up from about the early 20th century to about 1940, and then again from the late 1970s to the early 2000s. And these are rises uh, that were gained based on instrument data. And so how does that compare with temperature changes that we've inferred from proxy data that have happened over the last 2,000 years or so? From what I understand, the changes that we're seeing today are fairly consistent with changes that we've seen in the last 2,000 years.
Mm-hmm. That is to say, there is natural fluctuation.
Oh, absolutely. Nature has been doing this since we've had an atmosphere.
I mean, this is a silly thing to say, but I'm tempted to say, well, come on, global atmosphere, make up your mind. Are you going up or down? Well, the fact is that nature contains patterns that way preceded human beings, and those patterns have not been, eliminated. They keep going. What we're really actually arguing over is not so much is temperature going up or down. but what is the cause of various kinds of fluctuations? And if we see temperatures going up, is it appropriate to presume that it must be due to human influence when in fact these fluctuations have been going on for millennia and there may
Well,
be other
yeah,
sources?
yeah, that's absolutely right. I mean, I don't know how one can ascribe the current rise in temperatures to be exclusively due to human activity. We can't rule it out, but we certainly can't say that it's 100% of the
Right.
current climate changes.
Well, the solutions that are being advised on the basis of uncertain science are not uncertain solutions. They're pretty dramatic.
Yes, that's the problem too. We've got prescriptions for how to combat this problem, and we're not even sure that we're responsible for the problem, at least entirely. And so, to me, that is a wrong-headed approach. When you look at, and of course, when you look at what's happened in the United States over the last 2 decades, you've seen that the United States has seen a very large increase in the efficiency of appliances, the efficiency of vehicles,
Mm.
and even if CO2 is a problem, we're certainly doing our part to reduce our footprint just through the market. And so, I don't see the need to change course at this point.
The solutions always seem to be of kind of the same character. Namely, we need dramatically more powerful governmental or even international tools of control over economic activity. We need to dramatically constrict economic growth. Um, it seems to me that the penchant for these solutions seems stronger. The commitment to the solution seems stronger than the commitment to the scientific data. Uh, I remember, I'm old enough, just old enough to remember back in the 70s that global cooling was a big threat. And guess what the solution to global cooling was? Dramatically increased governmental control of economic activity.
Well, and that just, I don't know, I think that's just goes to human nature, that humans feel like we need to control our environment. We have to control what's going on around us, and that includes the economy and the trajectory of the economy. And so I think it's just a part of our nature.
Yeah, and that part of our nature is amplified, I would say. Now I'm speaking as a political scientist, but it's amplified by the fact that humans want to control and they develop this instrument called the state, which has
Yes.
a monopoly on tools of coercion, and they really want to deploy that tool in particular to achieve the desired control. And so the climate science now seems to be hostage to various ideological agendas. I just wish you guys could do your work and figure out what the facts are, and rather than trying to be pushed this way or that way by every wind of ideology.
Oh, right, right. And that's the luxury I have as a scientist. I can spend a career looking at something and taking the time to figure out how something works or how the climate acts, and I can publish what I learn over those years. Unfortunately, with politics, the politicians seem to need the answers much quicker if they're going to get reelected.
Well, that's the trouble. Yeah, yeah, exactly. So,
And so they glom onto these solutions. Let's do this now.
right, right. We have a bunch of people with us here listening to our conversation thus far. I've got a bunch of written questions. Also, let me remind those participating in the call that because this is a private webinar, you are free to go to that participant panel and or at the bottom of your screen and click raise your hand. And if you raise your hand, then I'm going to open up the mic for you to speak your own question directly to Tony Lupo. I do have one raised hand already and a bunch of written questions. So if you don't mind, I'm going to switch gears here for a few minutes, Tony, and turn to our friends who are with us. Let me begin with opening the mic to Dick, who's got his hand raised. Dick, if you open your mic, you can speak your question to Tony Lupo.
Dick Lamerting here. My question is, we hear so much about all the CO2 that we as the people pump into the atmosphere. Do you have any actual figures on that and as it relates to the total amount of CO2 that goes into the atmosphere, either on an annual or daily basis? I think I get the feeling that these figures, and again, the politicians are involved here, are putting forward, they seem to be pushing too high a percentage. Do you have any figures on that?
The exact figures I don't have right offhand. I have seen carbon budgets, carbon dioxide budgets, but I think you're onto something. You're correct in that saying that humans are probably a very small part. And if I'm remembering this correctly, again, I'd have to look at it myself or look it up again myself, but I believe we're less than 10% of the annual budget of carbon dioxide. And so we're a small part of it. And of course, a lot of folks will argue that maybe we're a small part of it, but we're a small part that's pushing the system over the top or pushing it out of equilibrium. But I do know that we're a fairly small part of the annual carbon cycle.
Let me open up Terry. Terry, do you have a question for Dr. Tony Lupo?
Hi, Tony. This is Terry, a friend of Willie's, so I'm glad to meet you in virtual space. I think that, there's a lot of claims about CO2, about the fact that it stays in the atmosphere for 1,000 years. It can warm the atmosphere significantly, as much as 30% of the average temperature. There seems to be a need to really do a lot more work on characterizing the impact of CO2, even though we know the impact is not as large as some claim. What are your general thoughts on how that could happen? And how much is this general question of CO2 impact, which is, as Will Happer would say, is largely positive, how much do you think this is covered in the book?
Well, a lot of this is covered in the book, especially the idea that CO2 can be a positive, and it is a food for plants, a food for agriculture. And so more CO2 is not absolutely a bad thing. In fact, less CO2 can be very dangerous. I think experiments have shown that if CO2 goes down to around 150 parts per million, that plants really start to struggle. And I think we were at 180 at the last ice age. But to get to your other part of your question, where you talked about the amount attribution of CO2, I don't think it's possible with the technology that we have to attribute CO2 to the point where we can say, oh, this fraction of the climate is being caused by CO2, much less human emissions. And so I just think our modeling and our technology is not at that stage yet where we can do that with any great certainty. And so that leaves open questions. Now, how to get there? Well, that's where we need more research funding in that direction and into attribution studies and folks who are willing to do that in a fair and unbiased way.
What we need is fair and unbiased science. I mean, I think
Yes.
everybody who's really paying attention realizes that empirical science is profoundly pushed by various ideological and political agendas. And, there are people who should be pushing, and that's their job. But your job as a scientist is objective empirical study. And we got to let you guys do your work. Okay, I have a question coming from my friend Bob, who's on the line. Bob, I've just opened up your mic, and if you will unmute yourself, Bob can ask his question.
Yes, I've seen research in the Russian publications where they seem to have less politics in their science, that the Vostok ice cores have shown quite positively that the warmer the planet gets due to solar activity, the less the ocean absorbs. And so the CO2 is a lagging, not a leading indicator. And their research also shows that in the past, admittedly, a few thousand years ago, we had higher CO2 at higher temperatures than we're experiencing now. And that material never gets published, at least in the United States. Can you explain that?
Well, and I think some of the research that you're talking about has been also published in our literature as well, but you don't see a lot of it nowadays because that certainly doesn't play well with the agenda of increasing CO2. Russian science has finally emerged from the bad old days of the Soviet Union and has become a little more objective and a little more circumspect about the idea that humans are the sole cause. I think when I talk to my Russian colleagues, they acknowledge that humans might be one of many factors, several factors that are involved in climate and climate change. Although you are seeing some pressure in some areas in Russia to get with the global consensus. So,
I mean, obviously, unfortunately, the Russians, at least during their Soviet period, 70 years, had a very bad track record of politics getting in the way of science.
oh yes, that shows the danger of politics and science mixing way too much.
Yeah, let's not go there. Here's a question I've gotten in writing from one of our friends, Perry. He says this: it seems to me that there's a good deal of agreement that the historical record includes times where world average temperatures, as difficult as they are to measure, were higher than in recent decades. If this point is conceded, doesn't any argument for catastrophic global warming fall apart regardless of CO2 measurements? I think we've kind of covered that, but give Perry an answer to that if you can, please.
Well, to my mind, yes. To my mind, yes. If it's been warmer in the past than it is today, then it doesn't seem that this is a big deal. It would just seem that our best strategy would be adaptation to climate change, and it's a strategy that's worked for our species for many millennia. So yes, if it's been warmer in the past, I would think the consensus falls apart.
Yeah, interesting. I mean, adaptation seems to be sort of a natural and logical conclusion, except it doesn't always point in exactly one direction or through using one method. If in fact the Earth's climate has been going through oscillations of many kinds for millennia, apparently sometimes correlated with solar flare activity and other things, human beings just have had to adapt rather than jump to the conclusion that it's to adapt before there's anything to adapt to. And that's kind of what seems to be going on. I think I see some more hands. Remember, you can press raise hand and I'll let you talk. I've got a raised hand from Terry still. Terry may have another question. Do you, Terry? If so, please feel free to unmute yourself and speak it, if Terry wants to. There's another question I've got here. Terry, interrupt me if you want to. But I've got another question here, which is, here's a question from Patsy. She says, this is a great question, Patsy. What is a useful question to ask of a campaigning politician regarding climate change? I mean, one that would help them and the rest of us think more scientifically.
Well, that's a very difficult question.
I know,
to
that's
answer.
hard.
Because as a scientist, I would tend to ask a scientific-based question, and a politician may not have the background or the information at his fingertips or her fingertips to be able to answer very well. If I were to ask them, I would just ask them, do you believe that that humans can credibly make a difference, or humans can credibly slow down the climate to the point where we can create the climate that we want? And because if you look at what people are trying to do through policies, it feels like people are trying to lock in what they feel like is the perfect climate, and the idea that we're even capable of that. And to my mind, we're not.
It sounds like what the ancient Greeks called hubris.
Uh, yep, hubris. Hubris is something that societies have had to tackle for many, or have had to wrangle with for many years.
Patsy's just given me another written response here. Her comment after that is that she would just like the politicians who are campaigning to just to say, wow, I don't know. If they would say that, they would be more honest, wouldn't they?
They would, and I'm not sure. I'm not sure why the answer "I don't know" has become a boogeyman for people. I'm up here, and if I don't have the answer, I'm going to tell you I don't know. But for some reason, politicians feel they need to have an answer for everything.
We are going to draw this to a close pretty soon here. If you want to get your own question in, feel free to type a few more or raise your hand. But I just want to ask you kind of as we're coming to a close here. Oh, Dennis, I'll get to you in a minute. But I just want to ask you, Tony, someone like you whose conclusions don't seem to line up with what we hear about constantly in the media regarding climate, has the fact that you have been a bit of a contrarian in your field, apparently, has that affected your career?
At the University of Missouri, not so much. I've been promoted up through the process. But if I
Good for Mizzou.
apply elsewhere, it has. It's gotten in the way a bit.
I'm going to turn to Dennis. And Dennis, I am allowing you to talk. If you open your own microphone, Dennis, you can speak your question to Tony Lupo.
Thank you. My question is, it seems like part of this discussion, or people talk about you're either an alarmist or a denier. I've seen work from folks, they call themselves lukewarmers,
That's a good one.
where the climate is changing. And I think part of the problem is we don't agree on, when people say climate, what period of time are we talking about? Because I think the alarmists are looking at the last 5, 10, 15, 20 years. And if you take the long view of thousands of years, or the fact that we've cycled in and out of ice ages, do you know, I guess my question is, when you think of climate, we say climate change, what does it really mean? What's the time dimension that we're talking about?
Well, if you go by a book definition, the book definition of what climate is that it's a 30-year period of statistics based on the data. And then, of course, if you change those statistics based on the next 30-year period or the next 30-year period, that would constitute climate change. And that's if you're taking a more observational look at climate, which is what folks like NOAA or NASA would do. If you're going to go into geological climate and climate change, then you're talking about very different timescales. But I agree with you in the fact that it's not. We try to make this thing this either or, that climate is changing or it's not changing, that the humans are 100% of the cause or humans are 0% of the cause, when the real answers lie somewhere in between there. It's just my feeling that that the human contribution is a smaller contribution, but there's a lot there's a lot of middle ground there, and unfortunately, if you stand in the middle of the road, the only thing you get is become as roadkill these days.
Yeah, sad to say. And I would just point out that you were just speaking off the cuff there, and you said that your feeling was that it was, as you described, your feelings are based upon your review of evidence. It's not just
Absolutely.
your feelings.
Yeah, bro, no, right, absolutely.
I knew you meant that. I just want to make that clear.
Yeah, if it just comes from my observations of the climate system and my own research and reading other
and
people's
evidence.
And reading other people's research.
I mean, I read this piece. You may have seen it in the Washington Post, and it was a number of other places over the past few days about this discovery in a Danish freezer of a core sample from Greenland that was taken back in the 1960s. They forgot about it, rediscovered it. Apparently, at the very bottom of this long tube of core sample, which went way down below the Greenland ice pack, they found evidence of leaves and twigs indicating that Greenland had at one point been not entirely covered with ice. And they dated it. Apparently, it's multiple thousands of years ago, but less than a million. So they don't know exactly when this was. It seemed clear to me that what that meant was that prior to any influence of human activity, any influence of human industrialization, airplanes, etc., that there had been natural cycles when Greenland was less icy than it is now, and apparently other times when it was more icy. That was what seemed to be the obvious conclusion to me. But the Washington Post article spun it so predictably, saying, well, this just shows how vulnerable Greenland is, and we've got to clamp down on human-caused global warming. Otherwise, Greenland's going to go back to the way it was back then, and the oceans are going to be higher. It seemed that there's this inexorable tendency to take any data and try and fit it to the agenda.
You're absolutely right, because you shared those articles with me, and I thought the exact same thing. At some point within the last million years, Greenland was ice-free, or at least ice-free where they dug the core.
Right.
And of course, that just points to a natural cause for climate change on that time scale.
Yeah, that's exactly what I thought.
Yeah, and even in the last 1,500 years, we know that Greenland has been warmer because we know that the Vikings had settled that area and had settlements, and that those settlements only went under at the start of the Little Ice Age.
There are things that we don't know about the natural world. We're trying to find out. There's a range of certainty that we can have, and a lot of things that we just can't know. What we can know, though, is that human freedom is extremely valuable and good, and that giving people the scope to exercise the use of their own private property, to exchange and trade, is beneficial, has raised millions out of poverty. To clamp down on the system of private property and free exchange for the sake of some very uncertain so-called scientific conclusion seems to me to be throwing a very good baby out with some bathwater. And I'm concerned about that politically.
Absolutely. And this goes back to what we were talking about a little earlier. We've got this problem that we think we need to address here and now, and we need government and government policy. When you look at what's happened in the last 2 decades, the United States had less carbon emissions in the last couple of years than we had 15, 20 years ago.
Right.
And per person, we've had less carbon emissions than we've had in almost 50 years. And that just points to the fact that the markets and market economics is doing the job of reducing our carbon footprint. Again, if CO2 is the problem, the market is handling it. And I just don't see the need to interfere.
Beautifully put. Beautifully put. By the way, my friend Bob just puts this last comment. He says Greenland got its name because it was green when it was first discovered. So true, Bob. So true. So I'm afraid we have to draw this to a close. It's been really a great pleasure to talk to you, Tony. I just want to remind the audience that next week we'll be mailing out a complimentary copy of Hot Talk Cold Science to all the members of our Lighthouse Society. So be on the lookout for that if you're a member of our Lighthouse Society. And of course, what that also means is if you're not yet a member of our Lighthouse Society, hey, you should become one. You can do that very easily by going to our website, independent.org. Top right, there's a donate button. When you donate to the Independent Institute, you are supporting research like the kind that Anthony Lupo, David Legates, and Fred Singer have done, producing books that, try and get people back to empirical evidence rather than just ideological knee-jerk reactions. Thank you to all of you for supporting our work. But for today, let me just say thank you finally to Dr. Anthony Lupo, University of Missouri. You've been a delight to talk to. Thank you for your work on this book.
Well, thank you for having me here today. I really enjoyed this back and forth, and I just love to talk. I could talk about the weather all afternoon.
I'm sure you could. You've made a
don't
career
have-
out of it.
Yeah, we don't have all afternoon, so I guess for now it's goodbye. Maybe we'll be back.
Yeah, we should talk further. And, this book came out last month. We've been promoting it in various places. It's doing reasonably well on Amazon. The frustrating thing is we've been getting the cold shoulder from the mainstream media on this book. And I think that we're going to, try and turn that around and get a little more of the attention that your book, Fred Singer's book, deserves. Your colleague, David Legates, will be joining you, I think, in some of these promotional activities in the near future. So, friends, thank you for making this possible. Thank you, Anthony Lupo. Keep up with the Independent Institute and take care, everybody. Bye-bye.